The auction gavel struck the wooden podium with a decisive crack, as Vivian Voss's heart plummeted to her stomach. At 21 years old, in the summer of 1876, she found herself standing on a makeshift platform in a dingy saloon in Sacramento, California, being sold like cattle to the highest bidder for the third time in as many months. "Sold!" bellowed the auctioneer, a portly man with yellowing teeth and breath that reeked of cheap whiskey. "To Mr. Harrington for $60. The crowd of onlookers, mostly men with hungry eyes and women with pitying glances, began to disperse as Vivian's new husband approached to claim his prize. Theodore Harrington, a balding man in his 40s with a face pockmarked from smallpox and knuckles scarred from brawling, grinned triumphantly as he handed over the money. "Come along, wife," he said, emphasizing the last word with a mocking tone that made her skin crawl. "Got a wagon waiting outside." Vivian adjusted the threadbare shawl around her shoulders, clutching the small carpet bag containing the entirety of her worldly possessions. Just 3 months ago, she had been in Boston, desperate and destitute after her parents died of influenza, leaving her with nothing but debts. The advertisement promising a new life as a mail-order bride in the West had seemed like salvation. Instead, it had been damnation. The first husband, a rancher outside Denver, had married her only to discover she couldn't cook to his standards. Rather than teach her, he'd sold her contract to a silver miner near Virginia City, who had expected her to work the claim alongside him from dawn until dusk. When she'd collapsed from exhaustion after 2 weeks, he'd cursed her as useless and sold her again. And now Harrington. "You'll work in my saloon," he informed her as he roughly helped her into the wagon. "Pretty face like yours will draw customers. And don't be getting any ideas about running off. Paid good money for you, I did." Vivian sat rigidly on the wooden bench, staring straight ahead. "Yes, Mr. Harrington." The journey to Harrington's establishment, a saloon called the Lucky Strike on the outskirts of town, took less than 30 minutes. It was a ramshackle building with peeling paint and windows clouded with years of tobacco smoke. A few horses were hitched outside and raucous laughter echoed from within. "Home sweet home," Harrington chuckled, helping her down with hands that lingered too long on her waist. "You'll sleep in the back room. Work starts now." Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap liquor. Half a dozen men lounged around tables, playing cards or drinking. They all looked up as Harrington entered with Vivian in tow. "Gentlemen," he announced proudly, "meet the new Mrs. Harrington. She'll be serving drinks starting tonight." The men hooted and hollered, raising their glasses in toast. Vivian forced a tight smile, feeling their eyes appraising her like merchandise. "Get her an apron, Mabel," Harrington called to a tired-looking woman behind the bar, "and show her the ropes." Mabel, a woman perhaps in her 50s with graying hair and deep lines etched around her eyes, nodded curtly and beckoned Vivian over. "First time in a saloon, girl?" she asked, handing her a stained apron. "Yes, madam," Vivian admitted, tying it around her waist. Mabel's expression softened slightly. "Just keep your head down and do as you're told. Harrington's got a temper when he drinks, which is most of the time." "How long have you worked here?" "Too long," Mabel sighed. "Since my Elijah died in '68, mining accident up in the hills. Had nowhere else to go." For the next few hours, Vivian learned the art of avoiding wandering hands while serving drinks, of smiling just enough to encourage more orders without promising anything more. Her feet ached, her back throbbed, and her cheeks hurt from the forced smile. As the night wore on, the saloon grew busier and rowdier. A piano player arrived and began plinking out tinny tunes on an out-of-tune upright in the corner. The air grew thicker with smoke and the stench of unwashed bodies. "Hey, pretty lady," slurred a miner as Vivian delivered a whiskey to his table. "How about a kiss with that drink?" Before she could politely decline, his arm snaked around her waist, pulling her roughly onto his lap. Vivian struggled against his grip, panic rising in her throat. "Please, sir. I need to get back to work. Let her go, Daniels." The voice was quiet but carried such authority that the saloon fell momentarily silent. Vivian turned to see a tall man standing just inside the entrance, backlit by the setting sun streaming through the doorway. He wore the dusty clothes of a working cowboy, but there was something in his stance that commanded respect. The miner Daniels loosened his grip just enough for Vivian to slip free. She smoothed her skirt and retreated a few steps, nodding gratefully to the stranger. "Ain't none of your business, Everett," Daniels grumbled. "Maybe not," the man replied, stepping fully into the light. He was younger than Vivian had initially thought, perhaps mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. "But I'd hate to have to explain to your wife why you came home with a broken jaw." A tense silence followed, broken only when Harrington emerged from the back room. "What's the commotion out here?" he demanded, then spotted the newcomer. "Wade Everett. Didn't expect to see you until cattle season." "Just passing through," Wade replied, his eyes briefly meeting Vivian's before returning to Harrington. "Thought I'd stop for a drink before heading to Pinos Altos." Harrington's demeanor changed subtly. "Pinos Altos, business with Caldwell, something like that." Wade moved to the bar, removed his hat, and placed it on the counter. "Whiskey. The good stuff, not the rotgut you serve the miners." As Mabel poured his drink, Wade's gaze drifted back to Vivian, who had resumed her duties serving tables. There was something in his eyes, not the predatory hunger she'd grown accustomed to seeing in men's faces, but something more complex. Curiosity, perhaps, or concern. The night wore on, and Wade remained at the bar, nursing his whiskey and occasionally exchanging words with other patrons. He seemed known to many of them, respected by most. Vivian noticed how he watched the room, missing nothing, including the way Harrington's hand would occasionally grip her arm too tightly, or how she flinched when he raised his voice. It was past midnight when the last customers began to leave. Harrington, deep in his cups by then, waved a dismissive hand at Vivian. "Clean up," he ordered, words slurring. "Then come upstairs. Time you earned your keep proper like." Vivian's blood ran cold at his meaning. She'd feared this moment would come and had no illusions about what awaited her in Harrington's quarters. To her surprise, Wade still sat at the bar, though his glass had been empty for some time. "Heading out, Everett?" Harrington asked, clearly eager for him to leave. "Actually," Wade said slowly, "I've been thinking about your new wife." Harrington's eyes narrowed. "What about her? I'd like to buy her contract." The room went silent. Even Mabel, wiping down tables, froze in mid-motion. "She ain't for sale," Harrington said flatly. "Got her fair and square at auction." Wade reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. He appended it on the bar, and gold coins clattered across the wood, far more than the $60 Harrington had paid earlier that day. "200, Wade said. "That's more than triple what you paid, plus profit for your trouble." Harrington stared at the gold, visibly calculating. Vivian stood frozen, a rag clutched in her trembling hands. Was she simply being sold again to a fourth man? Would this endless cycle never stop? "Why?" Harrington asked suspiciously. "What's your interest in her?" Wade shrugged, his expression unreadable. "My business. Do we have a deal?" After a long moment, Harrington's greed won out. He gathered the coins, bit one to test its authenticity, and nodded. "She's yours. Got the papers right here." He fumbled in his coat and produced the contract that had been passed from man to man, effectively selling Vivian's freedom. He scrawled his signature at the bottom and slid it across to Wade. Wade pocketed the document without reading it. "Miss," he said, addressing Vivian directly for the first time, "gather your things. We're leaving." Numb with shock, Vivian retrieved her carpetbag from the back room, her mind whirling with questions and fear. Was she jumping from the frying pan into the fire? What did this stranger want with her? Outside, the night air was cool and sweet after the stifling atmosphere of the saloon. Wade untied a magnificent chestnut gelding from the hitching post. "Can you ride?" he asked, his voice gentler now that they were alone. "Yes," Vivian replied, "though it's been some time." He helped her mount, then swung up behind her. The horse's muscles bunched beneath them as Wade guided it away from the saloon and onto the road leading out of town. They rode in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and the distant call of a nighthawk. Finally, Vivian gathered her courage. "Mr. Everett, Wade," he corrected. "Wade. I'm grateful for your intervention back there, but I need to understand what you expect of me." He was quiet for so long that she wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Nothing." "Nothing," she repeated, disbelieving. "I didn't buy you to own you, Miss Voss. I bought your contract to tear it up." She twisted in the saddle to look at him, searching his face for any sign of deception in the moonlight. "I don't understand," Wade sighed. "My sister came west as a mail-order bride 5 years ago. Ended up in a situation much like yours by the time I found her." He trailed off, his jaw tightening. "I was too late. I made a promise then that if I ever saw another woman trapped like that, I wouldn't ride away." Vivian felt tears prick her eyes. "So you're setting me free?" "Yes." They crested a small rise and he reined in the horse. Below them, the lights of Sacramento twinkled like fallen stars. "We'll stop at the hotel in town. You can have a proper bed tonight, and in the morning I'll give you enough money for a stage ticket back east." Back east, Vivian echoed, feeling strangely hollow at the thought. What waited for her there except painful memories and poverty? "And if I don't want to go back?" Wade seemed surprised by the question. "Where would you go?" Vivian considered this. Where indeed? She had no family, no friends, no prospects. The West had been cruel to her thus far, but something in her rebelled at the thought of slinking back to Boston defeated. "You mentioned Pinos Altos," she said slowly. "What's there?" "Silver mining town in New Mexico territory, growing fast. I've got a small ranch outside of town." "Do they need teachers?" "Before my parents died, I was training to become one." Wade was silent for a moment. "They might. Town's growing fast enough that there are plenty of children, but it's a hard journey and a harder life." "Harder than being sold 3 times in 3 months." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. His eyes softened in understanding. "Fair point. If it's what you truly want, I'll escort you there safely, but I want to be clear you owe me nothing. This isn't another transaction." For the first time in months, Vivian felt a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, Wade. I'd like to try Pinos Altos. A fresh start." He nodded and clicked to the horse, steering it toward town. "Get some rest tonight. We've got a long journey ahead." The hotel in Sacramento was modest but clean, and Wade secured 2 separate rooms without question. Vivian slept better than she had in months, despite the uncertainty of her future. The next morning, Wade was waiting in the lobby, having already arranged for supplies and a horse of her own, a gentle mare named Willow. "Can you ride astride?" he asked as they walked to the stables. "It's a long journey and side saddle will wear you out faster." Vivian nodded. "I grew up riding on my uncle's farm in Vermont." He thought side saddles were, as he put it, damned foolishness. Wade's lips quirked in the first hint of a smile she'd seen from him. "Smart man, your uncle." They set out as the morning sun crested the horizon, heading southeast. Wade explained they would follow the California Trail for a while before cutting across to pick up the southern route that would eventually take them to New Mexico territory. "It'll take us about 3 weeks, depending on weather and other factors," he told her. "We'll stop in towns when we can, but there will be plenty of nights under the stars." Vivian found she didn't mind the prospect. There was something liberating about the open country spreading before them, so different from the crowded streets of Boston or the confined spaces where she'd been kept these past months. The first few days were the hardest as her body adjusted to hours in the saddle. Each evening, she dismounted stiffly, trying not to show her discomfort. Wade pretended not to notice, but she would catch him adding an extra blanket near her bedroll or making sure she had the more comfortable spot by the fire. He was a man of few words, she discovered, but his actions spoke volumes. He hunted rabbits and quail for their meals, showed her how to set up camp efficiently, and taught her to read the land for signs of water or approaching weather. On their 5th night, camped in a sheltered gulch with a small stream nearby, Vivian finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Why a cowboy?" she asked as they sat by the fire after dinner. "You seem educated. You could have done many things." Wade looked up from cleaning his revolver, a habit he performed each evening with meticulous care. "My father was a professor at Harvard, expected me to follow in his footsteps." He reassembled the weapon with practiced ease, but I was never comfortable in that world of books and theories. After the war, I served with the Union cavalry. I couldn't go back to lecture halls. "So you came west?" "So I came west," he agreed. "Worked cattle drives, broke horses, tried my hand at mining, eventually saved enough for a small spread near Pinos Altos. It's not much, but it's mine." "Do you have family there? Besides your sister, I mean." A shadow passed over his face. "No, Emma was all I had left. Our parents died in a fire when I was 19, she was 16. He holstered the revolver and added a log to the fire. "What about you? You mentioned training to be a teacher." Vivian nodded, grateful for the shift in conversation. "My father was a bookbinder. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. He believed in education for women, so I attended the normal school." She sighed. "Then the influenza came. Both my parents were gone within a week of each other. The medical bills took everything, and I was desperate." "So you answered an advertisement," Wade finished for her. "Yes. It promised a respectable marriage to a ranch owner in Colorado. By the time I arrived and discovered he merely wanted an unpaid housekeeper, it was too late. I had no money to return east." "And he sold your contract when you didn't meet his expectations," Wade said grimly. Vivian nodded, staring into the flames. "The second man was worse. A miner named Garrett. He expected me to work the claim with him, hauling ore and panning from dawn till dusk. When I couldn't keep up, he beat me, then sold me to Harrington." Wade's knuckles whitened where he gripped a stick he'd been using to stoke the fire. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "Why, it wasn't your doing." "No, but—" He hesitated. "No one should be treated as property." They fell silent, listening to the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of a coyote. Vivian found herself studying Wade's profile, struck by the contradictions in him. His hands were calloused from ranch work, but he spoke like an educated man. He carried weapons with the ease of someone familiar with their use, yet she'd never felt safer than in his presence. As if sensing her scrutiny, he turned, catching her gaze. For a moment, something electric passed between them, then he cleared his throat and stood. "We should get some sleep." "Long day tomorrow." Vivian nodded, retreating to her bedroll and pulling the blankets around her. But sleep was long in coming as she pondered the enigma that was Wade Everett. The days fell into a rhythm as they traveled south and east. They passed through small settlements and mining camps, stopping occasionally to replenish supplies. In each town, Wade was careful to introduce Vivian as Miss Voss, a teacher heading to Pinos Altos, making it clear to anyone who might get ideas that she was under his protection. 2 weeks into their journey, they encountered their first major obstacle. Heavy rains had swollen a river they needed to cross, washing out the usual ford. They stood on the bank, watching the churning brown water surge past. "We'll have to find another crossing," Wade decided, scanning the horizon. "There might be a narrower spot upstream." They followed the river for several miles before finding a place where the water, while still swift, was shallow enough to attempt. Wade crossed first to test the footing, then returned for Vivian. "Stay close," he instructed, taking Willow's reins to lead her alongside his gelding. "If you feel yourself slipping, call out immediately." The crossing started well enough, the horses picking their way carefully across the rocky riverbed. They were nearly 3/4 across when disaster struck. Willow stepped into an unseen hole, stumbling badly. Vivian tried to steady her, but the mare panicked, rearing up. Vivian lost her grip on the saddle and tumbled into the rushing water. The current immediately swept her downstream. She fought to keep her head above water, gasping for air as the river tossed her like a rag doll. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard Wade shouting her name. Then suddenly he was there, his horse plunging through the shallower water along the bank. He leaned dangerously from the saddle, arm outstretched. Vivian reached for him, their fingers brushing twice, before he caught her wrist in an iron grip and hauled her from the water. Coughing and sputtering, she clung to him as he guided the horse out of the river and onto the bank. He dismounted quickly, lifting her down and setting her gently on the ground. "Are you hurt?" His eyes scanned her for injuries, hands hovering as if afraid to touch her. "Just shaken," she managed between coughs. "And cold." Without hesitation, he stripped off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then gathered wood for a fire with remarkable speed. Within minutes, flames were crackling and he'd retrieved a blanket from his saddlebags. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said, his tone practical rather than suggestive. "I'll turn my back. Wrap yourself in this blanket." Vivian hesitated only briefly before nodding. Wade turned away, giving her privacy as she struggled out of her sodden dress and undergarments. The blanket was blessedly warm and dry. "Finished," she said when she was decently covered. Wade turned back, relief evident in his face when he saw color returning to her cheeks. He hung her clothes near the fire to dry, then rummaged in his pack. "Here," he said, offering her a small flask. "Whiskey? Just a sip to warm you from inside." Vivian took a cautious swallow, grimacing at the burn but grateful for the spreading warmth. As she handed the flask back, their fingers touched, and that same electric feeling from nights before sparked between them. "Thank you," she said softly. "For saving my life." Wade's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me for that. Nevertheless, I am grateful, not just for today, but for everything. My freedom. This chance at a new beginning." He looked away, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Vivian said with certainty. "They wouldn't have. That's what makes you different, Wade Everett." He met her gaze then, and something in his eyes made her breath catch. For a moment she thought he might reach for her, but instead he turned to check on the horses. "Willow seems fine, just spooked," he reported. "We'll camp here tonight. Let your things dry properly." The incident at the river shifted something between them. Wade remained respectful, maintaining the boundaries he'd established, but Vivian noticed how his eyes followed her more frequently, how he found reasons to be near her. For her part, she found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, admiring the grace with which he moved, the quiet competence in everything he did. 5 days later, they reached the New Mexico territory. The landscape had changed dramatically from the California they'd left behind, more rugged, with towering mesas and vast stretches of desert punctuated by surprising pockets of greenery. "We're about 3 days from Pinos Altos now," Wade informed her one morning as they broke camp. "We'll pass through Silver City first. It's the larger settlement in the area." Vivian nodded, trying to ignore the strange pang she felt at the thought of their journey ending. These weeks on the trail with Wade had been challenging, but also freeing in a way she'd never experienced. There was a simplicity to their days riding, setting up camp, sharing meals by the fire that she'd grown to cherish. More than that, she'd grown to cherish his company. His quiet strength, his unfailing kindness, the rare but genuine smile that transformed his serious face. She'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, to understand what he was thinking even when he didn't speak. And she'd begun to wonder if perhaps he felt something similar. Sometimes she would catch him looking at her with an expression that made her heart race, only for him to look away quickly when she noticed. They rode into Silver City on a busy afternoon, the streets crowded with miners, merchants, and settlers. It was the largest town Vivian had seen since Sacramento, though still modest by Eastern standards. "We'll stay at the hotel tonight," Wade decided. "Get a proper meal and rest before the final stretch to Pinos Altos." The Silver Creek Hotel was a 2-story building in the center of town, considerably nicer than Vivian had expected. Wade secured rooms and suggested they meet for dinner after refreshing themselves from the journey. In her room, Vivian found a copper tub waiting, already filled with steaming water. She nearly wept at the luxury of a proper bath after weeks of creek waters and sponge baths. She washed her hair thoroughly and put on her second dress, thankfully still in good condition, having been carefully packed in her carpet bag. When she descended to the hotel's dining room, she found Wade waiting at a table. He stood as she approached, and she was momentarily taken aback by his transformation. He'd bathed and shaved, and exchanged his trail clothes for a clean shirt and vest. His dark hair, usually hidden beneath his hat, was neatly combed. "You look beautiful," he said with uncharacteristic directness, then immediately seemed embarrassed by his own words. "I mean, you look well, rested." Vivian smiled, touched by his awkwardness. "Thank you. You clean up rather nicely yourself." Dinner was the best meal she'd had in months: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and even apple pie for dessert. Wade seemed more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, telling her stories of his early days in the territory, the characters he'd met, the mishaps he'd survived. "Tell me about Pinos Altos," she encouraged, sipping the coffee that had been served with dessert. "What can I expect?" "It's smaller than Silver City, but growing rapidly since the silver strike in '60. Mostly miners and the businesses that serve them, but there are families too." Wade hesitated. "It can be rough at times, but the community looks after its own. And the need for a teacher, real enough. The children are being taught in a makeshift school by the minister's wife, but she's expecting a baby and will step down soon." Vivian nodded, hope blooming. A real teaching position, it was more than she dared to dream of when she'd left Boston. "And your ranch?" she asked, curious about where he'd made his home. "About 5 miles outside town. Nothing grand, a small house, barn, corral. I raise horses mainly, some cattle. It's peaceful." His expression turned wistful. "Sometimes too peaceful. You get lonely," Vivian observed. Wade looked surprised at her insight, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I hadn't realized how much until." He trailed off, eyes meeting hers. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Vivian's heart hammered in her chest as she wondered what he'd been about to say. Before either could break the silence, a commotion erupted at the front of the dining room. A man staggered in, clearly drunk, shouting for service. The hotel manager hurried over, attempting to quiet him, but the drunk pushed him aside roughly. Wade tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his holster, though he'd left his gun in his room. The drunk weaved through the tables, harassing patrons until his bloodshot eyes landed on Vivian. "Well, ain't you a pretty thing?" he slurred, lurching toward their table. Wade stood smoothly, placing himself between Vivian and the intruder. "Evening, friend, you seem lost." "Ain't lost. Saw a pretty lady." The man tried to peer around Wade. "Come have a drink with me, darlin'." "The lady is with me," Wade said evenly. "And I think you've had enough to drink tonight." The drunk's face darkened. "Think you're better'n me? I've got money." He fumbled in his pocket and produced a handful of coins, some of which clattered to the floor. "I can pay for her company." Vivian saw Wade's shoulders stiffen, his hands curl into fists. Before the situation could escalate further, the hotel manager returned with two burly men who firmly escorted the protesting drunk outside. Wade sat back down, his expression tight. "I apologize for that." "It wasn't your fault," Vivian assured him, though she was shaken by the incident. It had been an unwelcome reminder of how the world still viewed women like her as commodities to be purchased. "Perhaps we should retire," Wade suggested, noticing her discomfort. "We've an early start tomorrow." He escorted her to her room, pausing at the door. For a moment they stood in awkward silence. "Wade," Vivian began hesitantly. "That man downstairs, what he said." "Means nothing," Wade finished firmly. "You're not property to be bought and sold, not anymore, never again." The intensity in his voice made her look up, meeting his gaze. What she saw there made her breath catch a tenderness, a longing that matched her own growing feelings. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, seeming to struggle with himself before stepping back. "Good night, Vivian. Sleep well." The final day's journey to Pinos Altos took them through increasingly mountainous terrain. Pine forests replaced the desert scrub as they climbed, the air growing cooler and fresher. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Wade reined in his horse. "There it is," he said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled in a valley below. Pinos Altos. The town was smaller than Silver City but bustling with activity. Smoke rose from several stamp mills processing ore, and wagons trundled along the main street. Beyond the settlement, forests stretched into the distance, interrupted occasionally by meadows and streams. "It's beautiful," Vivian said sincerely. After the dusty trail and before that, the crowded streets of Boston, the pine-scented air and open spaces felt like paradise. They rode into town as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the rutted street. Despite the day's end approaching, the town was alive with miners coming off shift, merchants closing up shops, and saloon doors swinging open to welcome the evening crowd. Wade led her to a tidy two-story building with a sign proclaiming it Henderson's boarding house. "Mrs. Henderson is a widow who runs the cleanest establishment in town," he explained as they dismounted. "I sent word ahead when we stopped in Silver City. She's expecting you." Before Vivian could respond, the door opened to reveal a plump, gray-haired woman with rosy cheeks and a welcoming smile. "Mr. Everett, right on time as always." Her eyes moved to Vivian with undisguised curiosity. "And this must be Miss Voss. Welcome to Pinos Altos, dear. Come in, come in. You must be exhausted from your travels." Mrs. Henderson ushered them inside to a cozy parlor while chattering about the town, the other boarders, and the beautiful room she'd prepared for Vivian. Wade followed with Vivian's carpet bag, looking slightly overwhelmed by the woman's enthusiasm. "Tea?" "Coffee? I've just made a fresh apple cake," Mrs. Henderson offered, "Thank you, but I should see to the horses," Wade said. "And I've business in town before heading home." Vivian felt a pang of disappointment. After weeks in his constant company, the thought of him simply riding away left her feeling strangely bereft. "When will I see you again?" she asked before she could stop herself. Something flickered in Wade's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps, or hope. "I'll come by tomorrow. Help you get settled, introduce you to some folks in town. The school committee will want to meet you." Mrs. Henderson looked between them with barely concealed interest. "You must join us for Sunday dinner, Mr. Everett. I insist. Miss Voss will need a friendly face." Wade nodded, seeming relieved at the suggestion. "I'd be honored, madam." He turned to Vivian. "Until tomorrow, then." After he left, Mrs. Henderson showed Vivian to a comfortable room on the second floor with a view of the mountains. It was simply furnished but spotlessly clean, with a soft bed, a small writing desk, and a washstand. "Now, dear, you must be famished," the landlady said. "Come down when you're ready and I'll fix you a plate." Left alone, Vivian sat on the edge of the bed, emotions warring within her. She had achieved what once seemed impossible: freedom, a safe place to stay, prospects for respectable work. Yet as she looked out the window at the darkening sky, she realized that somewhere in the weeks of traveling with Wade, her heart had charted a course she hadn't anticipated. She was falling in love with him. The realization wasn't entirely surprising. Wade had saved her in every way a person could be saved: physically, financially, emotionally. But it was more than gratitude she felt when she thought of his quiet strength, his unwavering respect, the rare smile that transformed his face. Would he ever see her as more than someone he'd rescued? Or would he always associate her with the tragic fate of his sister, a reminder of his failure to save Emma? These questions churned in her mind as she washed up and changed for dinner. Mrs. Henderson proved to be as excellent a cook as she was a housekeeper, serving a hearty meal while filling Vivian in on the town gossip. "That Mr. Everett," she said as they cleared the dishes together afterward, despite Vivian's protests that she could help. "Never seen him take such an interest in anyone before. Usually keeps to himself, just comes to town for supplies or business." Vivian felt her cheeks warm. "He was very kind to escort me here. I'm deeply in his debt." Mrs. Henderson made a dismissive noise. "Kindness is one thing, dear. The way that man looks at you is quite another." Before Vivian could respond to this startling observation, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Henderson answered it to find a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair and spectacles. Reverend Phillips. "What a pleasant surprise," she exclaimed. "Good evening, Martha. I heard our new teacher had arrived and thought I'd pay my respects." His kind eyes found Vivian. "Miss Voss, I presume? I'm Reverend Phillips. My wife has been managing our little school, but as she's expecting our 5th child, we're most grateful for your arrival." Vivian shook his offered hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Reverend. I'm eager to begin teaching." "Wonderful. Perhaps you could come by the church tomorrow. The schoolroom is just behind it, and my wife can show you the materials we have." "Mr. Everett is calling for Miss Voss in the morning," Mrs. Henderson interjected. "I'm sure he wouldn't mind stopping at the church." "Excellent, excellent. We'll expect you around 10 then." The Reverend bid them good night, and Vivian retired to her room soon after, exhausted from the day's travel but too keyed up to sleep immediately. She stood at the window, looking out at the star-strewn sky and the silhouette of mountains against it. Somewhere out there was Wade's ranch, his home. She tried to picture it, the house he'd described, the corrals filled with horses, and Wade himself, perhaps sitting by his fire alone as he'd spent too many evenings. Morning brought clear skies and a fresh breeze carrying the scent of pine. Vivian dressed carefully in her best dress, arranged her hair neatly, and went down to breakfast. She just finished when there was a knock at the door. Wade stood on the porch, hat in hand. He'd clearly taken pains with his appearance, clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, wearing a fresh shirt and his least worn trousers. "Good morning," he greeted her, something almost shy in his manner. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you." She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "Mrs. Henderson is a wonderful hostess." "The best in town," he agreed. "I've brought the wagon. Thought we might collect your things from the livery and then make a few stops around town." The day passed in a whirlwind of introductions. Wade seemed to know everyone in Pinos Altos, from the blacksmith to the mayor, and all greeted him with respect. Vivian's reception was equally warm, with many expressing delight at having a proper teacher for their children. Their visit to the schoolhouse was particularly encouraging. Mrs. Phillips, a cheerful woman despite her advanced pregnancy, showed Vivian the modest collection of books and supplies, explaining the current arrangement of classes. "We have 22 students ranging from 6 to 16, she explained. "Most attend fairly regularly, except during planting and harvest times when the farm children are needed at home." Vivian felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of teaching again. "When would you like me to start?" "Monday would be perfect," Mrs. Phillips said with evident relief. "I've been having terrible morning sickness, and the doctors advised me to rest more." After leaving the church, Wade suggested lunch at the hotel dining room. As they ate, he outlined more about the town and surrounding area. "The silver mines are the main industry, but there's farming in the valley and ranching in the hills. Most folks are decent, hard-working people." He hesitated. "There are rough elements too, of course. Miners with too much money and too little sense on payday. Best to avoid the saloons on those nights." "I have no intention of frequenting saloons at all," Vivian assured him with a small smile. "My saloon working days are firmly behind me." Wade's expression darkened momentarily, and she regretted the reminder of her recent past. To change the subject, she asked about his ranch. His face brightened as he described the improvements he'd made over the past 3 years: the expanded corrals, the new barn, the spring house he'd built last summer. "I'd like to show it to you sometime," he said, then quickly added, "Mrs. Henderson could chaperone, of course, or Reverend Phillips and his wife. I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation." Vivian was touched by his concern for her standing in the community. "I'd love to see it." After lunch, they visited the general store to purchase a few necessities for Vivian: writing paper, hair pins, a new comb to replace one lost during their journey. As Wade paid for the items despite her protests, the shopkeeper's wife watched with a knowing smile. "You two make a handsome couple," she remarked. "How long have you been married?" Vivian froze, mortified, but Wade answered smoothly. "Miss Voss is our new school teacher, Mrs. Donovan. I merely escorted her from California as a favor to mutual acquaintances." "Oh, Mrs. Donovan looked embarrassed. "My apologies. It's just the way you look at each other." Wade cleared his throat, gathering the packages. "We should continue our tour. Good day, Mrs. Donovan." Outside, Vivian couldn't help but notice the flush creeping up Wade's neck. "I'm sorry about that," she said. "Small towns and their gossip. Nothing to apologize for." He offered his arm as they walked back toward the wagon. "People will talk. The important thing is that you establish yourself as the schoolteacher, not as someone associated with me." His words stung unexpectedly. "Are you ashamed to be seen with me?" Wade stopped short, turning to face her with surprise. "No, God, no, Vivian. I'm thinking of your reputation. A single woman in these parts needs to be above reproach, especially someone teaching children." Vivian considered this. He wasn't wrong. A schoolteacher was held to high moral standards, and her association with a bachelor could raise eyebrows. Yet something in his tone suggested there was more to his concern. "Is there something you're not telling me, Wade?" He sighed, guiding her to a bench outside the church where they could speak privately. "My reputation in town is complicated. Most folks respect me well enough, but there are rumors, stories about my past, some true, some not." "What kind of stories?" "That I killed men during the war. That I worked as a bounty hunter after. That I came west running from the law." He looked at her steadily. "The first two are true. The third isn't, though I did come west to escape memories." Vivian absorbed this. "I don't see how any of that should affect how people view me for being your friend." Wade's eyes softened at her use of the word. "Friend," he repeated as if testing it. "I hope we are that at least." That least hung between them, laden with possibility. Before Vivian could respond, they were interrupted by a shout from across the street. "Everett." "Thought that was you." A tall man with a sheriff's badge approached, grinning broadly. He clapped Wade on the shoulder before tipping his hat to Vivian. "Sheriff Taylor," Wade acknowledged. "Miss Voss, this is Ben Taylor, the law in these parts. Ben, Miss Vivian Voss, our new schoolteacher." "A pleasure, madam," the sheriff said. "You're a sight for sore eyes in this town full of ugly miners." Vivian smiled at his gallantry. "The pleasure is mine, Sheriff. Wade been showing you around. He knows this territory better than most, been here since, what, 68? 69, Wade corrected. "After my last cattle drive," the sheriff nodded. Right, listen, glad I caught you. There's talk of rustlers working the North Range. Caldwell lost 6 head last week. Might want to keep an eye out." Wade's expression turned serious. "I'll double my night watches. Thanks for the warning." After the sheriff departed, they continued their tour, but Wade seemed preoccupied. When they finally returned to the boarding house late in the afternoon, he declined Mrs. Henderson's invitation to stay for tea. "Need to get back before dark," he explained, "especially with rustlers about." To Vivian he added, "I'll see you Sunday for dinner if that's still agreeable." "Of course," she said, trying to hide her disappointment at his departure. "Thank you for today, Wade, for everything." He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary, something unspoken in his eyes. Then he nodded, mounted his horse, and rode away. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation for Vivian's new role. She spent hours at the schoolhouse, reviewing books, organizing lessons, and learning about her future students from Mrs. Phillips. The work was exactly what she needed: purposeful, challenging, and a reminder of the life she'd planned before circumstances had sent her on a very different path. Yet thoughts of Wade were never far from her mind. She found herself watching the road whenever she was near a window, hoping for a glimpse of him riding into town. Each night, she replayed their conversations, analyzing his words and expressions, wondering if the connection she felt was reciprocated or merely wishful thinking. Sunday finally arrived, bringing with it a nervous anticipation. Mrs. Henderson outdid herself for dinner, preparing a roast with all the trimmings, fresh bread, and a berry cobbler that filled the house with its sweet aroma. Wade arrived precisely at noon, clean-shaven and wearing a coat she hadn't seen before. He brought gifts: a bottle of good whiskey for Mrs. Henderson, and, to Vivian's surprise, a book. "I remembered you mentioning you enjoyed poetry," he said almost shyly as he handed her the volume of Tennyson. "Found this at Donovan's store yesterday." Vivian traced the embossed cover, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you, Wade. I shall treasure it." Dinner was a lively affair, with Mrs. Henderson drawing out stories of Wade's early days in the territory that he'd never shared with Vivian. She learned how he'd arrived with little more than his horse and the clothes on his back, working odd jobs before saving enough to claim land. He built that house of his with his own 2 hands, Mrs. Henderson told Vivian proudly, as if Wade were her own son. Finest craftsmanship in the county. Martha exaggerates, Wade demurred, though he looked pleased at the praise. It's a simple place. Solid and well-made like the man himself, Mrs. Henderson insisted, causing Wade to flush and Vivian to hide a smile. After dinner, Mrs. Henderson shooed them onto the front porch with coffee, claiming she needed to rest, but transparently giving them time alone. They sat in the matching rocking chairs, enjoying the warm afternoon and the view of the mountains. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Wade asked after a comfortable silence. "First day of teaching." "A little," Vivian admitted, "but more excited than nervous. It feels right being here doing this work." "You'll be wonderful," he said with such conviction that her heart swelled. "The children will adore you." They talked easily as the sun began its descent, casting golden light across the porch. Vivian realized with a start that this was the most relaxed she'd ever seen Wade. His usual vigilance softened into a quiet contentment. "I should go," he said eventually, though he made no move to rise. "Got to check on a new foal born yesterday." "A new life," Vivian smiled. "Boy or girl?" "Filly, black with a white star like her dam." His expression turned thoughtful. "You should come see her sometime. The ranch, I mean, when you're settled with the school." "I'd like that very much," Vivian said softly. Wade stood reluctantly. "Good luck tomorrow, though you won't need it." As he prepared to leave, Vivian found herself wishing desperately for some sign, some word that would clarify what lay between them. Was he simply being kind to someone he'd rescued, or was there more? "Wade," she said impulsively as he put on his hat. "Why did you really buy my contract that night?" He stilled, his back to her for a long moment before turning. "I told you, because of my sister. Is that the only reason?" She pressed, heart hammering. "Be honest with me, please." Wade's eyes met hers, and the vulnerability she saw there took her breath away. "No," he said quietly, "that's not the only reason." "Then why?" "Because from the moment I walked into that saloon and saw you, something shifted." He struggled with the words, a man more accustomed to action than emotional disclosure. "I couldn't bear to see the light in you dimmed by men like Harrington. I couldn't ride away knowing what awaited you." Vivian stood, moving closer to him. "And now? Why do you keep coming back to town when you could send word by anyone?" Wade's gaze never left hers. "Because I can't stay away from you," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Because these past weeks on the trail, seeing your strength, your grace despite everything you've endured. I've never met anyone like you, Vivian." Joy bloomed in her chest, bright and unexpected. "I feel the same," she whispered. "I think I've been falling in love with you since that first night when you stood up for me." He reached for her then, one calloused hand gently cupping her cheek. "I have no right to ask anything of you. You've only just gained your freedom, your independence. You're not asking, I'm offering." She covered his hand with her own. "My heart is mine to give, Wade Everett, and I give it freely." For a moment, he seemed frozen, as if unable to believe her words. Then slowly, reverently, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as Vivian responded. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Wade rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "Have for a while now, I think." Vivian smiled, joy bubbling through her veins like champagne. "And I love you." The sound of the front door opening caused them to step apart quickly. Mrs. Henderson appeared, looking not at all surprised to find them standing close together. "I forgot to send the leftover cobbler with you, Mr. Everett," she said with exaggerated innocence. "Can't have you going home to an empty cupboard." Wade accepted the carefully wrapped package with thanks, his eyes returning to Vivian. "I'll call on you Tuesday evening if that's agreeable." "After school, I'd like that," Vivian replied, unable to stop smiling. As she watched him ride away, Vivian felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Whatever the future held, she would face it with Wade beside her, not as her rescuer, but as her equal, her partner, her love. The following weeks were the happiest of Vivian's life. Her teaching career began successfully, the children proving eager to learn and the parents supportive of her methods. She quickly became a respected figure in Pinos Altos, invited to social gatherings and church functions. And then there was Wade. True to his word, he called on her regularly, their courtship conducted with propriety under Mrs. Henderson's approving eye. They took walks through town, attended church together on Sundays, and gradually, their story became known, an edited version that preserved Vivian's dignity while emphasizing Wade's role in bringing the new teacher to their community. A month after her arrival, Wade finally brought Vivian to see his ranch, with Mrs. Henderson accompanying them as chaperone. The property exceeded Vivian's expectations, a neat log house set in a clearing surrounded by pines, with corrals containing a dozen fine horses, a vegetable garden, and a small creek running along one edge of the property. "It's wonderful," she told him sincerely, as he showed her around. "Truly a home." Something in his expression shifted at her words. "It could be," he said quietly, "for her ears only. For both of us." Her heart leapt at his meaning, but before she could respond, Mrs. Henderson called them to the picnic lunch she'd arranged under a large oak tree. 2 weeks later, after Sunday services, Wade asked Reverend Phillips for a private word. When they emerged from the church office, the Reverend was beaming and Wade looked both nervous and determined. That evening, as they sat on Mrs. Henderson's porch watching the sunset, Wade suddenly dropped to one knee before Vivian's rocking chair. "I had a speech prepared," he began, "about how much I admire and respect you, about how strong and brave you are. But what it comes down to is simply this. I love you, Vivian Voss, and I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy sprang to her eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Wade Everett, I will marry you." He slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring. He explained and sealed their engagement with a kiss that prompted an approving "well, finally," from Mrs. Henderson, who'd been watching through the window. They were married 4 weeks later in the Pinos Altos church, with the entire town in attendance. Vivian wore a new dress of pale blue silk, ordered specially from Silver City, and carried wildflowers gathered that morning. Wade, looking handsome and slightly overwhelmed in a new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle on Reverend Phillips' arm. The celebration afterward was the largest the town had seen in years, with tables of food, music from a hastily assembled band, and dancing that continued well into the night. When the newlyweds finally departed for the ranch, Vivian having arranged for a substitute teacher for the following week, they were sent off with cheers and well wishes. Alone at last in the house that was now their home, Wade carried Vivian across the threshold as tradition dictated. He had clearly prepared for her arrival. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, the furniture had been polished, and wildflowers brightened every room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Everett," he said softly, setting her down in the center of the main room. Vivian looked around at the simple but comfortable space, at the man she loved watching her with hopeful eyes, and felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged, not as property, not as a mail-order bride sold to the highest bidder, but as a woman who had chosen her own path and the man she would walk it with. "It's perfect," she told him, reaching for his hand. "Everything is perfect." Over the next year, they built a life together that neither had dared to imagine for themselves. Vivian continued teaching, returning each day to the ranch she now called home. Wade's horse breeding business flourished under their combined efforts, his skill with the animals and her head for figures and organization. They faced challenges, of course. The rustlers that had troubled the area returned in force that winter, leading to tense nights of guard duty and one frightening confrontation that left Wade with a bullet graze along his ribs. Vivian's past resurfaced briefly when a miner new to town recognized her from Harrington's saloon, but the community that had embraced her closed ranks, making it clear that Mrs. Everett's history was her own business. Through it all, their love deepened, tempered by trials and strengthened by shared joys. When in the spring of their first anniversary, Vivian discovered she was expecting a child, Wade's reaction stunned disbelief, followed by a whoop of joy that startled the horses, became one of her most treasured memories. Their son, William Elijah Everett, was born on a crisp autumn morning in 1878, with Mrs. Henderson and the town doctor in attendance. Wade, who had paced anxiously outside during the birth, took his son in his arms with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "He's perfect," he whispered, sitting beside Vivian on the bed they shared. "Just like his mother." As she watched the man she loved cradling their child, Vivian reflected on the twisted path that had led her to this moment. The desperation that had driven her to become a mail-order bride, the humiliation of being sold from man to man like merchandise, the despair she'd felt standing on that auction block in Sacramento, all had led, improbably, to this perfect joy. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Emma Rose, named for Wade's sister and Vivian's mother. By then, the Everett Ranch had expanded, with additional grazing land and a reputation for producing the finest horses in the territory. Vivian still taught, though now only 3 days a week, having trained an assistant to share the duties. On a warm summer evening in 1882, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home watching their children play in the yard, Wade took Vivian's hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Do you ever wonder," he asked thoughtfully, "about coincidence and fate if I hadn't walked into that saloon on that particular night?" "I try not to think about it," Vivian admitted. "The what-ifs are too frightening." Wade nodded, pulling her closer to his side. "I used to think finding Emma too late was my greatest failure. Now I see it differently." "How so?" "Her tragedy opened my eyes, made me see what I might have ignored otherwise, made me stop and help when I could have ridden past." His eyes found hers, still filled with the same tenderness she'd first glimpsed years ago. "And that led me to you, to our children, to this life that's better than anything I deserved." "You deserved all of this and more, Wade Everett," Vivian said firmly, leaning against his solid strength. "You saved me in every way a person can be saved," he smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes crinkling. "No, my love, we saved each other." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Vivian watched her son building a fort of sticks and her daughter toddling after him on chubby legs. From inside came the aroma of the stew simmering for their dinner, and beside her sat the man who had paid not to possess her, but to set her free only to discover that in doing so he had freed himself as well. In the growing dusk, with the first stars appearing overhead and the sound of their children's laughter on the evening breeze, Vivian knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found what she'd been searching for all along. Not just a home or a husband, but the profound, life-changing gift of being truly, completely, unconditionally loved.